Early in 1942, the United States Navy began a campaign that would change the course of the Pacific War. The setting was the Dutch East Indies, now known as Indonesia, and the surrounding Pacific waters. This was a critical area during World War II. Japan depended on oil from these islands to fuel its war effort. Without this oil, Japan's military and industrial machines would grind to a halt. The U.S. Navy had a plan to disrupt Japan's supply lines. They used a strategy known as the wolf pack. A wolf pack is a group of submarines working together to hunt and destroy enemy shipping. It was a strategy designed to use surprise, coordination, and the cover of the vast ocean to strike fast and hard. The wolf pack would ambush Japanese oil tankers and merchant ships carrying vital supplies from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. Japan relied heavily on these shipments. The Dutch East Indies was one of the few places Japan could get the oil it needed. Japan's lack of oil resources at home made it vulnerable. The United States knew this and decided to strike at the heart of Japan's oil supply. The U.S. Navy's submarines were the perfect tool for the job. The attack on Japan's oil supply was carried out by U.S. submarines, such as the USS Swordfish and the USS Seawolf. These submarines would sail silently beneath the surface, sometimes for days, waiting for the right moment to strike. The U.S. Navy had intelligence about Japanese oil shipments, and they used this information to target the convoys. The wolf pack tactics were simple yet effective. Instead of operating alone, the submarines worked in groups. They would find a Japanese convoy and coordinate their attacks. One submarine would strike first, drawing attention away from the others. Then, the rest of the pack would close in, attacking from different directions. The Japanese, unable to defend against multiple submarines at once, lost ships quickly. The Japanese were initially unaware of how big the threat was. At first, they thought their shipping lanes were safe. Japan had many escorts and warships protecting their convoys, but these efforts were no match for the U.S. submarines. The Japanese warships tried to guard the oil tankers, but the submarines were fast and stealthy. They would strike quickly and then disappear, leaving the Japanese no chance to retaliate. One of the major targets was a series of oil tankers that carried oil from Borneo and Sumatra, key islands in the Dutch East Indies. These tankers were loaded with crude oil, the lifeblood of Japan's military. The U.S. submarines attacked these ships relentlessly. The attacks were often at night, when the tankers were most vulnerable. The Japanese could do little to stop the submarines once they were already under attack. The results were immediate. The loss of these oil tankers was a blow to Japan's war machine. The country depended on this oil to fuel its navy, air force, and industrial production. Without it, Japan's ability to wage war was severely weakened. The wolf pack's attacks on these supply lines forced Japan to divert resources and focus on defending its convoys, weakening its offensive efforts elsewhere. For the U.S. Navy, the attacks were a success. The submarines sank hundreds of thousands of tons of Japanese shipping. The damage to Japan's supply lines was huge. Japan's military was unable to replace the lost oil quickly, and the country began to feel the strain. The Japanese government tried to increase their efforts to protect their shipping, but the wolf packs kept attacking. The loss of oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies set off a chain of problems for Japan. It slowed down their military operations in the Pacific and affected their ability to maintain their war economy. The human impact of this battle was felt not just by the military but by the civilians in Japan and the occupied territories of the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese people felt the effects of the oil shortages. The war effort relied on oil not just for the military but for factories, transportation, and everyday life. As oil became scarcer, Japan's economy slowed. Rationing and shortages became widespread, and the Japanese people struggled to maintain the war effort. The submarines that carried out these attacks faced their own dangers. Life aboard a U.S. submarine was hard. Submariners lived in cramped, dangerous conditions. They spent weeks or months underwater, often under constant threat of enemy attack. When the submarines struck, there was little time to celebrate. The crews knew they had to stay alert, because the Japanese would soon retaliate. Even though they were outnumbered and outgunned, the U.S. submariners were highly trained, disciplined, and determined. Their success came down to strategy and the ability to work together as a team. On the other side, the Japanese also faced heavy losses. Their convoy systems, once thought to be safe, were now vulnerable to these new tactics. Japan's naval leadership scrambled to find ways to protect their tankers and merchant ships. They strengthened their defenses and sent more warships to protect the convoys. But no matter how much they tried, the U.S. submarines continued to break through their defenses. The Japanese military had to adjust their tactics. They began sending out decoy ships, trying to confuse the submarines. They also changed their shipping routes and increased patrols. These efforts, however, were not enough to stop the constant attacks. The U.S. Navy's Wolf Pack strategy had disrupted Japan's oil supply, and the impact of these attacks would be felt for the rest of the war. In the end, the U.S. Navy's Wolf Pack tactics proved to be one of the most effective strategies in the Pacific War. They cut off Japan's lifeblood, oil, and weakened Japan's ability to fight. The Japanese, despite their efforts to defend their convoys, could not stop the U.S. submarines. The attacks on the oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies were a turning point in the war. They showed how innovation, patience, and coordination could disrupt even the most powerful enemy. The U.S. Navy's Wolfpack tactics were a key part of the war in the Pacific during World War II. This strategy involved multiple submarines working together to target and destroy Japanese supply ships. The focus was on oil tankers and merchant vessels carrying vital resources, including oil, from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. The attack on these ships would cripple Japan's ability to continue its war effort, as the country's military and industrial operations were heavily dependent on these oil supplies. The Wolfpack strategy was different from traditional submarine tactics. Instead of having individual submarines operate alone, U.S. submarines would coordinate their attacks. This allowed them to work as a team, surrounding and overwhelming the enemy. Submarines like the USS Swordfish and USS Seawolf were key players in this tactic. They patrolled the waters around the Dutch East Indies, waiting for Japanese convoys to pass by. These submarines, built for stealth and speed, would sneak up on their targets and launch surprise attacks, sinking tankers and merchant ships before disappearing back into the ocean. Japan's oil supply was a critical part of its war machine. The country had little domestic oil production and was cut off from much of the world's oil supplies due to Allied blockades. The Dutch East Indies, with its vast oil fields in places like Borneo and Sumatra, became Japan's most important source of fuel. Without oil, Japan could not operate its navy, air force, or factories. The Japanese military knew how vital this resource was and took steps to protect the oil shipments. They set up convoys guarded by warships, hoping to keep their supply lines secure. However, the U.S. submarines were not easily deterred. The Wolfpack strategy used the ocean's vastness to its advantage. The submarines would strike when the time was right, often at night when visibility was low. Once the attack began, the submarines would coordinate their movements. One submarine would make the first strike, distracting the enemy and drawing their attention. Meanwhile, other submarines would silently move into position, launching their own attacks. This made it difficult for the Japanese to defend themselves, as they were being attacked from multiple directions at once. The technical precision of these attacks was impressive. The submarines used a variety of techniques to avoid detection and maximize the damage to Japanese ships. The submarines were equipped with torpedoes, which were launched at the targets from a distance. These torpedoes were designed to sink large ships with a single hit. The submarines also had radar and sonar systems that helped them locate enemy ships, even in the dark. The U.S. submariners were highly trained in using these tools, and their ability to track and destroy Japanese tankers was a key factor in the success of the Wolfpack. The impact on Japan's oil supply was devastating. The U.S. Navy's attacks on these oil tankers caused significant damage to Japan's ability to fuel its war efforts. Tankers carrying crude oil from the Dutch East Indies were sunk, and the loss of these ships disrupted the entire supply chain. The Japanese struggled to replace the lost tankers, and their military operations were hampered as a result. Japan's naval and air forces found themselves running low on fuel, limiting their ability to engage in combat. Factories that depended on oil to run their machines also faced shutdowns, further slowing Japan's war production. This disruption had a ripple effect on Japan's strategy in the Pacific. With oil shipments interrupted, Japan had to adjust its military plans. The loss of oil made it harder for Japan to keep up with the growing demands of the war. Their navy, once considered one of the most powerful in the world, was suddenly unable to operate at full strength. This imbalance in resources eventually helped the Allies gain an advantage in key naval battles, as Japan could not maintain the same level of operations as before. The success of the Wolf-Pack attacks was a direct result of the U.S. Navy's ability to operate in secrecy. The submarines were difficult to detect, and their stealth made them the perfect weapon against Japan's oil supply. The Japanese, caught off guard by the effectiveness of the attacks, had no way of defending against the constant strikes. Despite their best efforts to protect their convoys, Japan was unable to stop the loss of oil tankers. The coordination between the U.S. submarines was another factor that made the Wolf Pack so effective. Each submarine in the pack had a specific role to play. Some would launch the initial attack, while others would swoop in for follow-up strikes. This made it hard for Japan's defenses to respond to the threat. The Wolf Pack's ability to act as a unit, rather than individual submarines working alone, was one of the reasons for its success. While the U.S. Navy's submarines were attacking Japanese oil tankers, they were also taking great risks. Submarine warfare was dangerous. The submariners faced constant threats from enemy depth charges, warships, and the harsh conditions of being submerged for long periods of time. However, the U.S. Navy's submariners were determined. They knew that the success of their missions could turn the tide of the war. Their ability to work together using advanced technology and clever tactics was crucial in making the Wolf Pack strategy so effective. The Japanese, unable to stop the U.S. submarine attacks, found themselves in a difficult position. The loss of oil from the Dutch East Indies was one of the key factors that led to Japan's eventual defeat in the Pacific. The Wolf Pack, using stealth and precision, had cut off the lifeblood of Japan's war effort. The technical sophistication of these attacks, combined with the careful coordination between submarines, had made the U.S. Navy's Wolf Pack a formidable force. Through their efforts, the U.S. submarines had disrupted Japan's ability to wage war, forcing the Japanese to shift their strategies and slowing their advance in the Pacific. The hunt begins quietly, with U.S. submarines moving into position, following intelligence gathered from reconnaissance. They are looking for something specific: Japanese oil convoys moving from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. These convoys are vital lifelines, carrying the fuel needed to keep Japan's war effort alive. The U.S. submarines, like the USS Swordfish and the USS Seawolf, are patient and precise. They stalk their prey from beneath the ocean's surface, carefully tracking their targets while remaining hidden from enemy eyes. As the U.S. submarines close in, tension builds. The submariners know that if they are detected, the mission will fail. They use the ocean's vastness to their advantage, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every decision is critical. They need to remain unseen, while calculating the best possible angles to launch their attack. The tension is palpable. A wrong move could mean certain death for the crew or the failure of the mission. Then the moment arrives. A Japanese oil tanker appears on the sonar. The submarine commander gives the order to attack. The submarine surfaces briefly, launches its torpedoes, and then disappears beneath the waves. The torpedoes race through the water, guided toward their target. Moments later, there's a massive explosion. The tanker is hit. It begins to sink. The crew watches, waiting to see if any of the other ships in the convoy will respond. At first, the Japanese are unaware of the scale of the threat. They know that submarine attacks are a risk, but they don't realize that they are being hunted by multiple submarines. The U.S. Navy's Wolf Pack strategy is still a mystery to them. They think their defenses are enough to keep the convoys safe. The Japanese have warships and escort vessels, but they are not prepared for a well-coordinated, multiple submarine assault. As the attacks continue, the Japanese begin to react. They scramble to reinforce their convoy security, sending more warships and changing their tactics. But it's too late. The U.S. submarines are already in position, striking again. The Japanese warships patrol the waters, trying to defend the oil tankers, but they can't stop the attacks. The U.S. submarines work together, launching wave after wave of torpedoes. Each attack is carefully planned. The Japanese try to retaliate, dropping depth charges into the water, hoping to hit the submarines. But the U.S. submariners know how to evade them, diving deeper and changing course at the last second. The chase becomes a game of cat and mouse, with the submarines slipping past the Japanese defenses, undetected and relentless. One critical moment stands out. A large Japanese convoy, carrying a precious shipment of oil from the Dutch East Indies, is attacked. The convoy had been thought to be well protected, but the U.S. submarines strike with precision. The tankers, carrying thousands of barrels of oil, begin to explode in a series of violent bursts. The convoy is decimated. In a matter of hours, Japan has lost a major portion of its oil supply. The attack is swift, calculated, and devastating. The Japanese escorts, too slow to respond, are left helpless against the coordinated assault of the wolf pack. As the convoy sinks beneath the waves, the U.S. submarines slip away, retreating into the depths of the ocean. They leave behind a trail of destruction, but the battle isn't over. The Japanese are now on high alert, desperately trying to track down the submarines responsible for the attack. The U.S. submarines, however, know that they are always one step ahead. They continue their hunt, waiting for the next convoy to appear. The tension between the two sides grows as the submarine battles unfold. The Japanese, frustrated by the repeated losses, begin to rethink their strategies. They know they need to improve their convoy security, but they can't move fast enough. The U.S. submarines are already planning their next attack. They continue to pick off one tanker after another, each attack eroding Japan's ability to sustain its war effort. The Japanese fleet tries to mount a defense, but the wolf pack's ability to strike quickly and vanish into the deep ocean makes it almost impossible for Japan to catch them. Each successful attack by the U.S. submarines is another blow to Japan's supply lines. The Japanese military is left scrambling to find a way to protect their shipments, but the attacks keep coming. The U.S. Navy's strategy is working. Japan's oil supply is being cut off, and its military is running out of fuel. The convoys that once seemed secure are now targets. The Japanese warships that once protected these convoys can no longer guarantee their safety. The U.S. submarines, relentless in their pursuit, continue to sink ship after ship, forcing Japan to adjust and regroup, but never fully recover from the losses. This cat-and-mouse battle is more than just a series of submarine engagements. It is a struggle for survival. The U.S. submarines know that the success of their mission could have a profound impact on the war. The Japanese, caught off guard by the wolf pack strategy, are left trying to figure out how to stop it. The ocean, vast and unpredictable, becomes the stage for this tense, high-stakes battle. Both sides are playing for everything. For the U.S. Navy, the goal is clear: disrupt Japan's oil supply, cripple their war machine, and ultimately gain the upper hand in the Pacific. For Japan, every lost tanker is another step closer to defeat. The attacks continue, and the stakes only grow higher. As the wolf pack moves from one successful strike to another, the tension never lets up. The Japanese are in a race against time, trying to stop the onslaught, but with each day that passes, the U.S. Navy grows stronger and more confident in its ability to strike from the depths. The result is a series of tactical battles that will shape the course of the Pacific War. Each attack, each torpedo launched, and each sinking ship brings the U.S. Navy closer to its goal, while Japan's grip on its oil supply slips further away. Aboard the U.S. submarines, the atmosphere is tense. Every sailor knows that their mission is vital to the war effort. The submarine crews live in cramped quarters, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the endless expanse of the ocean. There is no room for error. The sailors experience the adrenaline of each successful strike, feeling the rush of hitting their target, but they also know that the risks are high. Each time they launch an attack, they are stepping into hostile waters, surrounded by enemy warships, listening for the sound of depth charges that could end their mission or their lives in an instant. The pressure is constant. Each attack is calculated, planned down to the smallest detail. The crew works together like a well-oiled machine, with every man knowing his role. When the torpedoes are fired and the ship makes its escape, there is a brief moment of victory. But that moment is short-lived. The submariners know that they must remain alert. The Japanese will retaliate, and the next hunt is already beginning. There's also a sense of moral conflict among the men. They know that these attacks are part of the larger effort to defeat Japan, but they also understand the impact of their actions. The tankers they target carry not only oil for the military but essential resources for civilians. The crew members understand that the damage done to these tankers will severely cripple Japan's ability to wage war, but they also recognize that it will cause suffering for civilians. There is a weight to these decisions that stays with them. They know they are fighting a necessary war, but there is still the knowledge that the people caught in the middle of it will feel the consequences. For the Japanese military and government, the attacks come as a shock. At first, they do not fully grasp the scale of the threat. Japan has always protected its shipping routes with escorts and military vessels. The convoys from the Dutch East Indies have long been considered secure, vital lifelines that keep the country's war machine running. The Japanese believed their defenses were enough to guard against any potential threat. When the U.S. submarines first strike, Japan is caught off guard. There is no immediate response to the surprise attacks. The attacks continue, and the Japanese military begins to realize that their once secure shipping lanes are now vulnerable. As the attacks intensify, Japan scrambles to reinforce its defenses. More warships are sent out to guard the convoys, but the U.S. submarines continue to evade them. The Japanese are forced to confront the reality that their shipping routes are no longer safe. They had assumed that their oil supply was secure, but now they are losing it with each passing day. The shock of these losses spreads through the military and government. They realize that the U.S. Navy's tactics are more effective than they had anticipated. The wolf pack is relentless, and Japan's response is slow and ineffective. For the Japanese sailors and merchant ships, the surprise attacks are terrifying. Many of them had never experienced an assault like this before. The oil tankers, once considered safe, are now vulnerable to sudden and violent attacks. Some Japanese sailors attempt to fight back, firing guns or launching counterattacks, but they are outmatched by the speed and stealth of the U.S. submarines. Others, realizing that there is no hope of survival, abandon their ships and swim to safety. The chaos of these encounters leaves the Japanese with few options. They are caught off guard and forced to deal with the shock of these attacks, unsure of how to protect their vital convoys. Meanwhile, in the Dutch East Indies, the effects of the attacks are felt deeply by the civilians. The islands are under Japanese occupation, and the local populations are already living in difficult conditions. As the U.S. submarines continue to cut off Japan's oil supplies, the effects on the civilian population become more evident. Oil, once plentiful, begins to run low. Factories close down. Transportation systems grind to a halt. People are left without the resources they need for daily life. The civilian population, already struggling under occupation, now faces new challenges. Food becomes scarce, and basic goods are harder to come by. There is a growing sense of fear. The local population knows that their survival is tied to Japan's ability to maintain its war effort. As the Japanese struggle to keep their supply lines open, the civilian population begins to feel the strain of the war in a very real way. In the cities and villages, rumors spread. People talk about the attacks on the oil tankers and the ships that never arrive. They hear stories of Japanese soldiers becoming more desperate as the supplies they once relied on dwindle. The sense of unease grows. Civilians realize that they are caught in the middle of a war they cannot control. They are helpless to stop the destruction that is coming their way, and they can only wait to see how the war will unfold. The fear is not just for the present, but for the future. As the Japanese military is forced to retreat or shift its focus, the civilians of the Dutch East Indies know that their lives will change. They watch as the Japanese struggle to maintain control over the islands, realizing that the war is slowly turning against them. The loss of oil, combined with the U.S. Navy's growing presence in the Pacific, signals a shift in the balance of power. The people of the Dutch East Indies are caught in the middle of this struggle. They have little control over their fate, and the uncertainty of the war's outcome hangs heavy in the air. For all those involved, U.S. submariners, Japanese sailors, and the civilians in the Dutch East Indies, the human reaction to these events is complex. There is fear, uncertainty, and moral conflict on all sides. The war is no longer just a battle between armies. It is a struggle that reaches into the lives of everyone involved, changing their world in ways they could not have imagined. The impact of the U.S. Navy's Wolfpack attacks goes beyond the immediate military results. It shapes the lives of the people caught in its wake, forcing them to confront the harsh realities of a war they cannot escape. Japan's military strategy, already under strain due to its rapid expansion across the Pacific, begins to crumble under the weight of the U.S. Navy's targeted attacks on its oil supply. The oil from the Dutch East Indies had been vital for fueling Japan's military machinery, including its fleet, air forces, and industrial needs. As U.S. submarines continuously disrupt this lifeline, Japan is forced to deal with a critical shortage of oil. This shortage affects not only their military capabilities but also their civilian infrastructure, which had been heavily dependent on this resource. Japan's logistical network, once well-oiled and efficient, now faces massive delays and shortages. Factories are forced to slow down, and transportation systems become inefficient, further hampering Japan's ability to maintain the war effort. The loss of oil forces Japan to reevaluate its military strategy. The Navy, in particular, faces the most severe constraints. Without enough fuel to support large-scale operations, Japan cannot continue its offensive strategies across the Pacific. The lack of oil directly limits the country's ability to move troops, resupply ships, and conduct airstrikes. Critical operations, such as maintaining their positions in Southeast Asia or reinforcing island garrisons, are now difficult to sustain. The once unstoppable Japanese war machine is brought to a halt, and the reality sets in: Japan's expansion across the Pacific is no longer feasible. Faced with these constraints, Japan shifts its focus. It must now adopt a more defensive posture, trying to protect what it has gained rather than seeking new territories. The Japanese military scrambles to strengthen its existing positions and protect its remaining oil resources. But the attacks from U.S. submarines do not stop. The Wolfpack continues to strike, crippling Japan's ability to sustain its military operations. This shift to a defensive strategy is a massive blow to Japan's ambitions and plays a critical role in the larger conflict of the Pacific War. Japan's inability to keep its war machine fueled becomes increasingly evident as the months pass, and it struggles to maintain its control over occupied territories and garrisons. The U.S. Navy's successful disruption of Japan's oil supply marks one of the key turning points in the Pacific War. As Japan's ability to continue its aggressive military campaign diminishes, the Allies gain momentum. The once formidable Imperial Japanese Navy, unable to fuel its ships and aircraft, is no longer able to dominate the Pacific in the same way. This growing vulnerability is made clear during the Battle of Midway, where Japan's weakened navy faces a decisive defeat. The inability to fuel their forces and maintain operational readiness contributes to Japan's failure to achieve its objectives in the battle and marks a critical moment in their eventual defeat. The global implications of these attacks are significant. The success of the U.S. Wolfpack strategy shows how submarines, previously seen as a secondary tool of naval warfare, can become a primary weapon for disrupting enemy supply lines. The ability of U.S. submarines to operate with stealth and precision, sinking Japan's oil tankers and merchant ships, sets a precedent for future naval tactics. The attacks on Japan's oil supply show the strategic value of targeting an enemy's logistical network, a tactic that would be refined and used more extensively in the years to come. As the war progresses, the U.S. Navy's submarine warfare tactics evolve. Submarines become an increasingly important part of the naval strategy in the Pacific, not just for direct combat, but for their ability to choke off vital supplies. The U.S. Navy focuses more on training and equipping its submarines, improving their ability to track and destroy enemy ships while remaining undetected. The lessons learned from the Wolfpack attacks are used to refine submarine tactics, making them even more effective at disrupting enemy operations. The U.S. Navy also adapts its methods for hunting and attacking Japanese convoys, improving its intelligence networks and focusing on key supply routes. The success of the Wolfpack also forces Japan to change its approach to naval warfare. In response to the loss of oil and the growing threat from U.S. submarines, Japan invests heavily in anti-submarine measures, increasing patrols and developing new technologies to detect and destroy submarines. But despite these efforts, the damage has been done. The U.S. Navy has gained a decisive advantage, and Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific is severely limited. Even as Japan improves its anti-submarine tactics, the constant threat from U.S. submarines keeps its military on edge, unable to fully secure its supply lines or reinforce its far-flung bases. This shift in naval strategy, driven by the U.S. submarine attacks on Japan's oil supply, becomes one of the defining features of the Pacific War. Submarines, once considered auxiliary vessels, now become a key part of the Allied effort to cripple Japan's war machine. The success of the Wolf Pack in the early years of the war proves that strategic disruption of supply lines can be just as devastating as direct combat. As the U.S. refines its submarine warfare tactics and the Japanese struggle to protect their vital resources, the balance of power in the Pacific shifts. The impact of these attacks is felt not only in the immediate battles but also in the broader strategies that define the rest of the war. By targeting the lifeblood of Japan's military operations, the U.S. Navy created a ripple effect that weakened Japan's offensive capabilities and tilted the balance in favor of the Allies. The strategic shift in warfare is clear. The disruption of vital supply lines, once thought of as a secondary consideration, now plays a central role in shaping the outcome of the war. The success of the Wolf Pack tactics changed the course of naval warfare in profound ways. U.S. submarines had demonstrated the power of coordinated attacks, using stealth and precision to destroy Japan's vital oil supply lines. This tactic, though new at the time, became a model for future submarine warfare. The idea of using multiple submarines working together in a coordinated attack was expanded and refined in the years that followed. This strategy, once perfected during World War II, would be used in later conflicts, including the Cold War and beyond. The lessons learned from the Wolf Pack would influence the development of submarine tactics throughout the 20th century. Submarines would no longer be seen as isolated units working alone but as part of a larger, coordinated strategy. Naval forces around the world took note of the success of the U.S. Wolf Pack. The idea of working in packs surrounding and overwhelming enemy vessels became a cornerstone of submarine warfare. The tactics employed by the U.S. Navy during the Pacific War influenced the way submarines were used in later decades. This shift in strategy also contributed to the increased importance of submarines in modern naval operations. The concept of using submarines to disrupt supply chains, much like the U.S. Navy did to Japan's oil supply, became a primary focus for naval planners across the globe. For Japan, the loss of its oil supply had lasting consequences. Japan's reliance on the Dutch East Indies for oil was a key part of its military strategy. The inability to replace the lost oil had a profound impact on Japan's ability to maintain its military operations. As the U.S. submarines systematically destroyed Japan's oil tankers, the country found itself unable to sustain its war machine. The lack of fuel crippled Japan's Navy and Air Force. It became increasingly difficult for Japan to continue its offensive operations, and its military power began to weaken. By the time Japan realized the extent of the damage done to its oil supply, it was too late. The country was already stretched thin, and the oil losses were a blow from which it could not recover. The inability to maintain military operations without critical resources like oil became one of the key factors that led to Japan's eventual surrender in 1945. The disruption of Japan's oil supply by U.S. submarines had put the country in a vulnerable position. As the war continued, the strain on Japan's ability to fight became evident. The loss of oil weakened Japan's ability to resist Allied advances, and its once formidable military forces were unable to operate at full capacity. In American military circles, the story of the Wolf Packs is remembered as one of the great naval victories of World War II. The U.S. Navy's ability to disrupt Japan's oil supply and cripple its war effort is seen as a testament to the strategic thinking and tactical ingenuity of the submariners. The Wolf Pack campaign became a symbol of American resilience during a time of great uncertainty. The effectiveness of the submarines in attacking large, vulnerable supply chains showed how innovation could turn the tide of war. The success of these attacks demonstrated that even the smallest units could have a massive impact on a nation's ability to wage war. The story of the Wolf Packs also highlighted the importance of careful planning and coordination. Submarines, once seen as small, specialized vessels, had become powerful tools in the larger strategic picture. The ability to work together as a coordinated unit, rather than independently, was key to the Wolfpack's success. This approach changed the way naval battles were fought and proved that even in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, the U.S. Navy could strike decisively. The legacy of the Wolfpack campaign is not just in its immediate results but also in its lasting impact on military doctrine. The campaign also became a symbol of determination. The submariners who carried out these missions faced tremendous risks, operating in hostile waters under constant threat of attack. Yet they pressed on, knowing that their actions were critical to the success of the war effort. The Wolfpack campaign was a testament to the resolve of the men who carried out these dangerous missions, often at great personal cost. They were not just fighting to win battles but to break the enemy's will to fight. Their success in sinking Japan's oil tankers was more than just a military achievement. It was a symbol of what could be accomplished through innovation, courage, and coordination. This determination was echoed across the U.S. Navy and throughout the Allied forces. The story of the Wolfpacks showed that strategic thinking and adaptability could lead to success even in the most challenging circumstances. The ability to disrupt Japan's oil supply was a critical factor in turning the tide of the Pacific War. It highlighted the importance of attacking the enemy's weaknesses, even if those weaknesses were not immediately apparent. The Wolfpack campaign demonstrated that small, well-coordinated actions could have far-reaching effects, and it set a precedent for future military strategies. As a result, the tactics employed during the Wolfpack campaign became a lasting part of U.S. naval doctrine. The use of submarines to disrupt enemy supply lines, once considered a bold and unconventional strategy, became a cornerstone of modern naval warfare. The lessons learned from this campaign continued to shape the way submarines were used in later conflicts, and the impact of the Wolfpack's success continued to resonate in naval strategy for decades. Through their innovation and determination, the U.S. submariners had forever changed the way naval warfare was fought and set a new standard for how to weaken an enemy through strategic disruption.